So let's quickly review what we saw in the previous modules. First of all, we talked about the idea of performatives, which are special kinds of utterances that are used to do things instead of say things, right? And then in the next module, we saw how ultimately that idea kind of fell apart, and that we can't maintain a clear distinction between performatives and other kind of language, because it seems like actually all utterances and all language has kind of a performative aspect to it, or all utterances can be used to do things, whether or not they're really performatives, right? So that's kind of where we were left off after the last two modules. And based on that problem, we're going to see the idea of speech acts and illocutionary force, which is sort of a way that we can maintain the useful parts of the idea of performatives, but integrate them with an understanding of how the rest of language works. So the idea behind illocutionary force is that everything we say does multiple things. So we can't just say like, this utterance is a performative and that utterance is a constative, all or nothing. Actually, everything that we say has features of both of them, or everything that we say performs multiple acts. Right? So when we say something, we are doing several actions at the same time. And that's what we call a speech act. And we could break down this action into several other pieces. So when I utter something, I'm performing at least three kinds of acts. The first one is called locutionary act, which is what we actually say, right? This is sort of the semantic meaning or the truth conditional meaning. It's the words and the sentence that we say. But in addition to the locutionary act, I also perform an illocutionary act, which is something about how I want other people to understand what I'm saying, right? So I say something that means something, and that's a locutionary act. But I also intend for that utterance to be a threat or a promise or an apology or something like that. That is my illocutionary act. And the last part of the utterance is the perlocutionary act, which is the effect it has, or what happens because of the thing that I said. Right. So these sound a little bit abstract by themselves, but we can try to think of what's the boundary or the distinction between each of these two. So for example, if we think about the illocutionary act and the perlocutionary act, I think sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between these, but there are certain kinds of illocutionary and perlocutionary acts where it's a little bit clearer to see the difference. So for example, when I warn someone, I'm doing an illocutionary act, right? I'm performing the act of warning. And I hope that they will listen to my warning, right? For example, if I warn them not to do something, I hope they won't do something. And that effect would be the perlocutionary act, right? If I warn them to stop something, I hope they will stop something. That would be a perlocutionary effect. But it's possible that they might not listen to my warning and they might keep doing the thing I told them not to do, right? So that would be an example of where I can make an illocutionary act without having the intended perlocutionary effect, right? I warn someone, but they don't listen. I make the illocutionary act, but it doesn't have the effect I wanted. Another example is arguing and convincing, right? So arguing for some point is an illocutionary act, right? I say something and it has some meaning, but the reason that I said that is because I wanted to argue something. I wanted to make some point. That's an illocutionary act. And when I make that act, I hope to convince someone. Convincing them would be the perlocutionary effect. But they might not be convinced, right? Maybe I make an argument, but the person doesn't change their mind. So I do the illocutionary act of making an argument, but I don't achieve the perlocutionary effect that I wanted. So these examples can kind of show us the difference between illocutionary and perlocutionary acts. The other important distinction, remember, is locutionary acts and illocutionary acts. Remember, a locutionary act is just what you say. And the illocutionary act is the force you mean with it, right? That you mean it to be an apology or a promise or whatever. So a very famous example that we always hear about in pragmatics is an utterance like, can you pass the salt? Right? Which literally this is a question, right? That's the locutionary act, is asking a question. But in a normal conversation, we usually don't mean this as a question, right? We're usually not trying to get information. We're trying to get a person to pass the salt. So it's actually a request. So maybe the locutionary act that we perform is saying a sentence, which is a question, but the illocutionary act is making a request, trying to get someone to pass the salt. Another example that we can see from another sort of news controversy. Let me give you a little bit of background about this controversy. In 2017, the United States president at the time was Donald Trump and got involved in a lot of kind of scandals. One of these controversies happened when one of Donald Trump's allies was being investigated for some kind of crime. And Trump went to the person doing the investigation and sort of urged him to drop the investigation and stop investigating. So a lot of people got upset about that because they said, he is using his power as the president to protect his friends from the law, something like that. So at the time, Trump and Trump's supporters defended him by saying he never ordered the guy to drop the investigation. He just said, I hope you can stop this investigation. So he didn't order, he just said he hopes. But of course, the person in charge of the investigation later said that he understood that to mean an order, right? The idea is, if your boss tells you, I hope you will do this, then usually you will interpret it as your boss is ordering you to do this thing. So this is another example of how the locutionary act of just saying that you hope something could be interpreted as an illocutionary act of giving an order. So the bottom line is, we take the idea of performatives, right, that language can be used to do something, but we further develop that idea to say that it's not the case that some utterances are performative and some are not. Actually, every utterance has this part of it. Every utterance can be used to do something like a performative. So every utterance has at least these three parts, right? It's locutionary content, which is what it literally means, and it's illocutionary force, right? The way that it's intended to be taken, right? So this concept, particularly of locutionary content and illocutionary force, is useful in a lot of pragmatics, and you can see how it is a little bit similar to what we saw before about what is said and what is meant. But the bottom line is, everything we say has multiple parts to it, including what it literally means and the force with which it is meant to be taken.